welcome back to Taxation Is Theft Fest 2020. I'm Dre, your host from Drunk and Disorderly Media, here with our last guest of the fest. So we will be talking with Joe Banister next, and he is going to tell us how he went from favored Fed to enemy of the state in 11 years flat as a former IRS Criminal Investigation Division Special Agent. So I'm excited to talk to him about that. After that, we will have a panel with Mr. Berman and the rest of the hosts here. He suckered into doing this weekend. And then that will be it. So let's welcome Joe.
Hi, Dre. How are you?
Good, thanks, Joe. How are you?
Good, thanks. Great. Well, I call my talk Favored Fed to Enemy of the State in 11 years flat. And the reason I do that is because it was 1993 when I was sworn in as an IRS special agent. And it was 2004, 11 years later, when I was indicted by a federal grand jury on 4 felony tax counts. So an interesting 11-year period that I'm going to try to run through here pretty quickly. This is an old recruiting poster, and the IRS, of course, they're the ones that tout catching Al Capone, and so they're quite proud of that. And of course, he was reputed to be a really, really bad guy, so they couldn't seem to ever catch him with any of his illegal activities, but they could sure catch him with his toys. So financial investigators really do an amazing job at being able to track down criminals. That's kind of what drew me to the employment. I was sworn in November of 1993 in Oakland, California. I was assigned to the San Francisco, California office to begin with. There's my business card. Interestingly enough, I was a certified public accountant when I entered the IRS, and my boss, my manager, was very upset with me for putting CPA on my business card. In fact, the first day on the job, he said, "You're no longer a CPA. You're a special agent now." I guess as if the two could not coexist. So there's a picture of me helping with a Citizens Police Academy in East Palo Alto, California. And the reason this picture, I think, is informational is, of course, it shows part of the interesting aspect of the job. I did a lot of money laundering investigations and worked with the DEA and the Secret Service and the Customs Service and also local police departments, including the East Palo Alto Police Department. And we did a Citizen Police Academy here. And so the local media at the time had covered the event. So you can see I had a lot less white hair then. So I come from a family of terrorists. You could see that on the far left, hopefully it's showing that way on your screen, in the tan uniform. That's my brother, John. He recently retired as a lieutenant from the California Highway Patrol. The next to him in the dark police uniform is our baby brother, Jeff. He's still a police officer with the San Jose, California Police Department. My mom, Ann, in the middle. My dad couldn't be pictured because he had passed away earlier that year. My brother, Jim, he is a battalion chief with the Daly City Fire Department. And then there's me with my treasury gun and badge there on the end in the white shirt and tie. This is my uncle, my brother's deceased father's brother, Gary. He spent 30 years in the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office. And, I point that out basically to show that I didn't come from anti-government, knuckle-dragging mountain dwellers, come from a family of government servants. And in fact, still believe government service can be noble. I'm kind of disappointed in government service as of late, especially with all the talk of deep state and all the evidence that's coming out relating to what went on in the Obama administration, but that's not the topic of my talk. So anyway, I spent many years in the private sector from 1986 when I graduated from San Jose State University. Spent a number of years in the private sector and just looked ahead and thought there is no way that I can with this accounting degree and a certified public accountant, that I can be, your phone book CPA for 30 or 40 years of a career. I need something to spice up my career a little bit more. So I decided to pursue employment with either the FBI or the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and actually moved quite rapidly through an FBI application process. But unfortunately, they had a hiring freeze. This is back in the 90s when Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House. And as happens from time to time, there was a hiring freeze. And so even though I had passed through all of the FBI testing, physical testing, psychological testing, was basically waiting for an appointment letter to Quantico, Virginia, they had a hiring freeze, which lasted, I think, a couple of years as far as the FBI was concerned. Meanwhile, I had also applied to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division because they also looked for people with accounting degrees, really like CPAs if they could find them. So the IRS was also looking for people, and I had applied there. And so it turned out that even though my heart was with becoming an FBI agent, and I hope you'll excuse me, this is back in the early 90s when they still enjoyed somewhat of a better reputation than they do today. I do shiver to think that had I been in there, I'd probably be up there with all those crazy people in headquarters under Comey undertaking all these shenanigans. So it probably worked out for the best. Anyway, I was hired in November of 1993 as an IRS special agent. San Francisco office was my first post of duty, or POD as they call it. And so just briefly going through my 5.5-year career there, rose to the highest level of non-management grade before my 5th year anniversary. Received the Superior Performance Award and Sustained Superior Performance Award. Received the Top Athlete Award. I was the Asset Forfeiture Coordinator for the Central California District, Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force Coordinator for the Central California District, and also a Firearms and Defensive Tactics Coordinator. So you might think that that looks like a pretty rewarding career for an IRS special agent, but you might want to think again. So what happened was I was working at the job 1993, 1994, 1995. Then in 1996, about 3 years into my career there, I was listening to a talk radio show in the San Francisco Bay Area. The radio station's still around. It's KSFO in San Francisco, and they broadcast to most of the San Francisco Bay Area. And there was a woman on the show named Devy Kidd, her kind of an unusual first name, Devvy, and Kidd, Kidd. She's still around and being very active, rooting out corruption. But Devy Kidd was on this talk show hosted by a guy named Jeff Metcalf. And he had her on the show, and she was talking about the federal income tax and basically saying that the income tax was voluntary. And, here I was, as you saw with the picture, I carry a gun and a badge around, bulletproof vest in the trunk and handcuffs. And, I thought to myself, lady, this income tax ain't voluntary. I can assure you of that. So, but anyway, I was a little bit intrigued because she was on this show hosted by Jeff Metcalf, and he was, had always been a very truthful, a very pro-Constitution kind of a guy. And I was mindful of my oath that I took to support and defend the Constitution. So I liked listening to him. But then there was this disconnect because he had Devy Kidd on his show saying that the income tax, wasn't mandatory for the vast majority of Americans. And she said a bunch of other interesting, to say the least, allegations too. Talked about the Federal Reserve, New World Order, one world government, those kinds of things. And, remember, we're talking about December of 1986. I'm sorry, December of 1996. I don't want to pull a Joe Biden on you. And, back then it was like whoa, only weird people talk about this kind of stuff. But anyway, she was talking about it on a mainstream radio station, the income tax being voluntary, Federal Reserve, New World Order, that kind of thing. So because of that disconnect, because of had some trust built in the talk show host, Jeff Metcalf, and yet having this, kooky kind of lady coming on with some kooky ideas, I decided to investigate further into her allegations about the income tax. I ordered some booklets that she had, for order, like $1 a piece. So she certainly wasn't making any money off the deal. And that started about a 2-year investigation throughout 1997 and 1998 and the beginning of 1999, me looking into these claims about the income tax. And, if I had any bias at all, I would have to say it was against this DV Kids allegations. I mean, my whole professional life was wrapped up around the income tax. So, she couldn't possibly be right, but I still kept looking because I thought, well, how could I have trusted this Jeff Metcalf to be an honorable talk show host? If I'm this great investigator, I've got to get to the bottom of this. So I spent 2 years off duty, after work, weekends, days off, whatever it took to look into these issues while still going to work every day as an IRS criminal investigator. And after that 2-year period, I basically came to at least a preliminary conclusion that there was something to these allegations. In other words, I came across a great deal of facts and evidence indicating that indeed the IRS was deceiving the American people about what their income tax obligations were and are. And the deceit is mainly because even certified public accountants, even tax attorneys, don't take on the entire Internal Revenue Code. They all have specialties. They're all trained, of course, with textbooks, and rarely will dig into the actual law, the actual regulations, the actual court cases. And so it's just not that many people, even the professionals, that dig deep and take a look. And I didn't create anything. I'm not any special kind of a guru. I just was someone that the IRS trusted to carry a gun and a badge around and investigate violations of federal tax law. So they certainly considered me to have a certain level of competence. And so I began to poke around and see if these allegations of the income tax were true or not true. And I intended to basically speak up about who was telling the truth and who was lying, no matter what the result of my poking around might do. Of course, at that time, I thought, well, I'm sure this DV Kid lady couldn't be telling the truth, because that would mean that I'm not in the right profession, that I'm basically helping the agency to lie to people and steal from them. And I certainly don't think that could be the case. So I embarked on this investigation off duty throughout 1997, 1998, and early 1999. And I came to the end, as I say, about December of 1998, January 1999, and realized I really had exhaustively looked into the issue and found a lot of very, disheartening evidence to show that the IRS was lying to the public. So I decided to approach my supervisors at the IRS and explain my concerns, show them my research, and basically seek out their guidance so that if I was wrong, they could show me where I went wrong. And I'd be happy to report to as many people as they wanted that I was wrong, and I embarked down this road. I believe these tax protesters, and I'm sorry, I blew it. Here's why. Well, they didn't do that. They wouldn't answer any of my questions, and they decided that I should resign, that I should not be, I didn't deserve any answers to my questions. So in approaching my supervisors at the IRS, I wrote a report. And it's actually, sorry, back here. This is a scan of the cover page, Investigating the Federal Income Tax, a Preliminary Report. And it was about 95 pages. And I handed it to my supervisors along with expressing verbally my concerns about, what I had uncovered over those last couple of years. And inside the report was 3 allegations. Due to the constitutional limitations, most Americans are not required to file income tax returns and pay income tax. 16th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was never legally ratified, and the U.S. government finances its operations from the unconstitutional creation of fiat money, not with revenue from income taxes. I provided a kind of a transmittal letter to go along with my report and to when I was expressing my concerns orally to my supervisors. And the long and short of the letter, of course, was that if the Internal Revenue Service declines to conduct its own analysis or dismisses the evidence in this report without proper review, then I must tender my resignation. My oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States was made to God, and I cannot serve 2 masters. Well, the response I got was pretty rapid, and it was not very helpful. The chief of the Criminal Investigation Division, now they're called Special Agents in Charge, like all the other federal law enforcement agencies. But they told me that the Internal Revenue Service will not be responding to your request and will provide you with the necessary paperwork to tender your resignation. So even though they had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on training me, even though, as I said, I was an award-winning special agent, everybody was saying, "Hey, Joe, when are you going to get into management?" All of a sudden, when I started asking questions about the legitimacy of the administration and enforcement of the income tax, all of a sudden I was a really bad guy, and I needed to hit the road and hit the door as quickly as possible. So I was sent home for a week of administrative leave, and realized that, if I were to go back to the IRS, I really didn't trust that they might not try to destroy my otherwise good reputation. So I decided that it might be best to actually resign. I knew that I could speak more freely. And so I went ahead and tendered my resignation. Interestingly, the date, that was my birthday in 1999. And that was also the date in 1913 when the 16th Amendment was proclaimed to be ratified. And that basically ushered in what we all know today as the contemporary income tax. So certainly a date I won't soon forget. By the way, these letters are on my website, AgentForTruth.ccom. The letter was addressed to Commissioner Rosati, who was the commissioner at the time. And again, long and short of a very long 4-page letter, based on the obvious futility of continuing to work for an agency that has standards and practices so different from what it professes, and standards and practices so contrary to my own, I'm officially resigning from the position of IRS Criminal Investigation Division Special Agent, effective as of the date of this letter. Well, after I resigned in February of '99, and again, everybody has to put on their go back in their memories. Certainly, people like me, I'm 57. There was a time when there wasn't any internet, and we still had more, media organs that were not tied into the internet. But that's still where a lot of information spread quite rapidly. And so I ended up being featured on media organs such as C-SPAN, MSNBC, CNBC, 60 Minutes, and the New York Times. And there was also a group called the We the People Foundation for Constitutional Education. And there were several full-page ads that this foundation took out in the USA Today. And one of them featured a couple of other IRS agents that I ended up meeting and becoming very good friends with, Sherry Jackson and John Turner. And so needless to say that all this publicity was not well liked by the Internal Revenue Service. It kind of had the feeling of, the OK Corral, where it's like, hey, Wyatt Earp and all these guys, or, to the crooks, say, hey, this town ain't big enough for the both of us, and so somebody's got to leave because somebody's right and somebody's wrong. Somebody's on the right track, somebody's not. Somebody's deceiving and somebody is not. So the long and short of all this publicity was that it caused the IRS to get very upset with those of us who were trying to get answers to our questions about the evidence that we had encountered. And so we even tried, this is just prior, notice the date, the 20th of July, 2001. This is just prior to the 9/11 tragedy in September of 2001. And we got this close to having congressional styled hearings about the impact of the Internal Revenue Service and the way that it administered and enforced the Internal Revenue Code, and also how the Department of Justice prosecuted, tax cases. And so we actually had Roscoe Bartlett, who was a representative from Maryland, put down in writing that a representative of the Department of Justice, a Mr. Bryant, would actually participate or bring officials from the Department of Justice to participate in a congressional-styled briefing, a hearing that would occur where we could air out these grievances and try to get to the bottom of this, the income tax. And, hey, we came across this evidence. It looks to us like the IRS is deceiving the public. You and the Congress are the ones that write the laws. You're the ones we're coming to help us investigate it. And to his credit, Roscoe Bartlett was agreeable and trying to help. And this just a blow up of Dan Bryant's actual agreement in writing. Interestingly enough, the IRS representative agreed to participate, but refused to agree in writing. So as I said before, the IRS had just about enough of people asking questions, especially credible people. They can't have that, so then they have to move to silence you, discredit you, and just do whatever they can because they're still the big man on campus, and there can't be more than one. So what happened was in November of 2004, I was indicted on 4 federal counts that would have put me in federal prison for quite a few years. And they claimed, the Department of Justice had got a grand jury convened, and they issued a true bill, an indictment, claiming that I violated 4 different federal violations. 3 of them were that I prepared false federal income tax returns. And the 4th was that I conspired to defraud the United States of America. I was indicted with a client. Basically, the government's claim was that I conspired with the client to do all these terrible things. Now, interestingly, this probably won't come as a surprise to any of the viewers, but the IRS and the Department of Justice have a well-oiled publicity machine, and so they were kicked into high gear that they got this former IRS special agent and CPA who was doing all these bad things, and they basically convicted me in their press release, although at the very end they claimed that I'm innocent until proven guilty. For example, they said the blatant and far-reaching defrauding of honest taxpayers by these 2 individuals warrants an aggressive federal prosecution. This case should serve as a stark reminder to our citizens that caution should be heeded when approached by those advocating wild theories, like that one does not have to obey the federal tax laws. So they claim that I conspired to defraud the United States. basically conspired with my client as he stopped withholding from his workers' paychecks. And that I conspired with the client to prepare these false amended federal income tax returns. And there was three years involved, so that's why there were 3 counts. And the the biggest problem for the IRS and the Department of Justice, having indicted me on these charges, was that, of course, they trained me very well about how to be a financial investigator. And I don't say that to brag. I just say that compared to the average person in the public, I mean, I was caught like a deer in the headlights. I'd never thought they would ever do such a thing to me. But at least I had some training as to how to defend myself. And that training came from the very people that were attacking me. So the funny thing about this picture is that my principal attorney, Jeffrey Dickstein, he was working in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the time. And once I determined that I wanted him to represent me, he said, well, okay, you got to send me all your research. And I said, okay, Jeff. And so I proceeded to send him 18 boxes of research shipped from San Jose, California at the time to Wisconsin. Because, of course, a defense attorney, actually any attorney, prosecutor, or defense, has to be very familiar with all the documents relating to the case. And so the documents were so voluminous that they were even taller than my attorney. And by the way, another funny thing about that picture is that when Jeffrey Dickstein motioned the judge for more time for us to prepare, he actually attached this photo to his motion to the judge. So I thought that was very clever. Truly, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in the trial, and again, I have so little time here, but of course I'm grateful for the time I've been given. So I have to kind of go through this pretty quickly. The prosecution tried to disqualify one of my defense attorneys. The other attorney, Robert Bernhoft, which I'll just put in a little plug, Bernhoft Law, BERNHOFT, bernhoftlaw.com. Bob is still in practice, and he's even defended people like Wesley Snipes. So you might want to check him out. But anyway, they tried to kick Bob Bernhoft off of my defense team a couple days prior to trial. The government had a 28-year veteran, IRS agent, was basically the government's expert witness. And the guy couldn't point out a single false entry on the tax returns I prepared that the government claimed I had prepared falsely. And of course, if those that are familiar with court procedure, you have direct testimony where the side that has the witness will call the witness. Then you have cross-examination where the other side gets to question the witness. And he couldn't point out anything false under the direct testimony given by the prosecutor or under the cross-examination coming from my defense attorney. And when you think that, they're claiming that I prepared these false tax returns, you'd think they could find at least one thing false on one page, one line of one page somewhere, but they couldn't find a single thing. Witness after witness testified that they observed no conspiracy. So remember, I was charged with conspiracy, yet witness after witness, the prosecution paraded into the courtroom. And when asked directly, did you see a conspiracy going on? Did you see anything that looked like a conspiracy? They all had to answer no. And of course, even the prosecution couldn't bring forward any documentary evidence that there was a conspiracy. So here I was, charged with conspiracy, and the government couldn't bring any evidence or witnesses forward to prove it. The case investigator, another special agent, actually a guy that I used to work with, Sean Breslin, he had to testify that he encountered no evidence that the IRS was impeded, impaired, or obstructed. That's what they claimed I conspired to do, was to impede, impair, or obstruct the IRS. And the agent who ran the investigation said he didn't encounter any evidence that I had done so. And, you know, for investigators or people that are amateur investigators, you know that there's something called the elements of the crime. You need to fulfill the elements of the crime if you're going to go and prosecute somebody. And he couldn't even fulfill the elements of the crime, yet I was indicted and prosecuted. Now, on our side, the defense, we only called one witness, and that was my former supervisor at the IRS. And learning from the jurors later, not a single juror ever voted for conviction during any of the deliberation polling. Anyone that served on a jury or knows how that works, you deliberate, and if you decide you're going to kind of poll your jury to find out where people stand, but nobody ever, voted for conviction even during the preliminary votes. And one of the two prosecutors didn't even show up for the verdict when the verdict was read. And the verdict was not guilty on all 4 counts. And that was back on June 23rd, 2005, almost 15 years ago. So I think another thing, I just have a feeling that the viewers are not going to be surprised at. There was one thing that really just warmed my heart, and that was the media response to my acquittal. Because you know how the media is so truthful. This was the headline after my acquittal. The verdict was cheered by tax evaders. And they definitely had to point out that the accountant, me, acquitted, but still faces loss of his license. So, they're just telling people, this guy's still, going over the cliff. So the media is just, you can always depend on the media to try to lead people in a particular direction, influence them. So the bottom line is the federal government, in my opinion and all my research, deceiving the American public about their income tax obligations. It results in trillions of dollars of tax that is paid through deceit, intimidation, and where necessary, illegal force. Hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of property are taken illegally. And this is more of a recent development that I learned. Again, the viewers are probably familiar with some of the players in this whole operation to remove Trump and spy on Trump and go through all this. There's a particular character who actually was in the top of the Department of Justice tax prosecution hierarchy when I was indicted. And so he would have had to, have I seen his signature on a document? No, but he was sitting in the top chair and would have had to approve of all of the prosecutorial harassment that I was subjected to. And so maybe you won't be surprised when you learn his identity. It was actually Rod Rosenstein. Before he had got into his current position, he was actually running tax prosecutions, or at least being the highest ranking Department of Justice official to make sure that people like me could not speak and try to show the truth to our fellow Americans. So just briefly, some of the things that I've kind of come to conclude over the last 20 years. That the average working American is not liable to pay the federal income tax because no bill, no legislation was ever passed into law that made the average American liable to pay the federal income tax. And that's an important, really important legal point. You don't have to be an attorney to understand that. The law clearly states that only Americans who are liable for the income tax are required to keep records and file tax returns. So you might ask, does the IRS agree with what I just said? Do you have to be liable for a tax before being required to file a tax return? Well, why don't we look at the 1040 instructions. And you can look at any year you want. I have 2012 here just because I've been making this point for a few years. But you can look at any instruction booklet, take your pick. Go to the Disclosure, Privacy Act, and Paperwork Reduction Act notice and read the wording for yourself. Generally, it's going to be down in the third paragraph. Our legal right to ask for information is Internal Revenue Code Section 6001, 6011, and 6012A, and their regulations. They say, meaning these sections and their regulations, say that you must file a return or statement with us for any tax you are liable for. Your response is mandatory under these sections. There's also ample evidence that the 16th Amendment was fraudulently ratified, but there's been all kinds of litigation. The man who gathered all the proof of the fraudulent ratification was actually accused of lying about his ratification documents, and then when he tried to enter his ratification documents into court evidence, the court refused to let him put in the evidence, and yet they called him a liar. But that's really another whole story. But we'll just set aside that the 16th Amendment was fraudulently ratified. We'll say, okay, it was ratified. What does the United States Supreme Court say about the 16th Amendment's power? Or shall we say the federal government's power to tax after the 16th Amendment came into existence? In the Brushaber case, the Supreme Court said the provisions of the 16th Amendment conferred no new power of taxation. In the Peck and Co. versus Lowe, the 16th Amendment does not extend the taxing power to new or accepted subjects. In the Eisner versus McComber case, as repeatedly held, the 16th Amendment did not extend the taxing power to new subjects. Also, most Americans, certainly the ones that just work for a living, they don't have income as that term is defined over and over again by the United States Supreme Court. In the Stratton's Independence case, the gains derived from capital, from labor, or from both combined. That's what income is, gains. In the Eisner versus McComber case, a gain, a profit, something of exchangeable value, proceeding from the property, severed from the capital, being derived, that is, received or drawn by the recipient for his separate use. And the reason that I have a picture of an apple tree here is to illustrate what they're talking about. If you pick the apple from the apple tree, that's the same, what they're trying to say, you're picking the fruit or the gain from the apple tree. You're not hacking a branch off to get the apple. You're not hacking at the trunk and toppling the entire tree to get the apple. You're pulling off the apple. And then next season, more apples will grow. You can pull all the apples off of this. You can pull all the income off of this tree, so to speak. And then next year, the tree will produce new apples or new income. So that's what they mean when they say derived from, severed from the capital. The capital is the tree, and the apples that can be pulled off the tree are the income. So you might ask yourself, how could the contemporary federal income tax system that's over 100 years old be in existence, yet there's no law making the average American liable to pay the tax? And you might wonder, was it a mistake? Was it oversight? Was it a loophole? I'd just like you to remember those Supreme Court cases that I showed you. Brushaber, no new power of taxation. And what happened in a nutshell is that the people that wanted the 16th Amendment to be added to the Constitution expected that 16th Amendment would give them carte blanche taxing power to tax all Americans. And in fact, the first Income Tax Act of 1913 did exactly that. But then the 1913 Act was repealed by the 1916 Act. And all of a sudden, the average American was not covered by the 1916 Act, nor any act after that. And that's basically what I'm just saying in this slide. That, but the 1913 Act, being as broad as it was litigated, and the case went up to the United States Supreme Court. And you remember that I talked about this Bruchaber case in 1916. It was that Bruchaber case that caused the Congress to go, whoa, I guess we thought that the 16th Amendment would give us this carte blanche power, but the Supreme Court isn't playing along. They're saying in the Bruchaber case that we don't have that kind of power to tax. And so we're going to retract or scale back the income tax laws to only apply to non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. But, we're talking about 1916. They didn't have internet. They didn't have TV. I don't think they even had radio, at least not widespread. And so these are all things that you find in the bowels of the archives, but it's not something that was widely known. So here the IRS has never had the authority in the law to tax the average American, yet they've extracted trillions of dollars from the American people. And I thought I'd show you just for good measure, again, because I'm just a former IRS special agent. You don't have to believe me, but let's look at what the IRS's own internal literature said, see if it confirms what I'm talking about. So I apologize. This probably isn't very easy to see, so I'm going to have to try to describe it. But basically, this entire document is the IRS organizational chart from the late 80s, okay? And it shows the commissioner here, and then it shows a deputy commissioner. And then along this lineup here, all these other arrows are various assistant commissioners. So that probably would make sense to you, assistant commissioners. And there's an assistant commissioner for criminal investigation, assistant commissioner examination, assistant commissioner collection, assistant commissioner international. So you'd think if I was a criminal investigator, that I would work under the criminal investigation division, wouldn't you? But it turns out that I didn't. And I may have to kind of go quickly through this. But you remember in the previous organizational chart, we had the deputy commissioner. Then here are all the assistant commissioners. Okay. So we're going to key in on this assistant commissioner international. Notice that he has an office of compliance under him or her, whoever was serving in that role back then. There's the Assistant Commissioner International. So drilling down on the Assistant Commissioner International, notice down here in the Office of Taxpayer Service and Compliance, you have the Criminal Investigation Division. You also have Collection, Examination, and Taxpayer Service. But here's where I worked, Criminal Investigation Division. Now, this is in the Internal Revenue Manual. Back, you can see this is in 1989. And this is what the IRS's own Internal Revenue Manual, its own internal procedure manual, said about the division that I worked in. That the Criminal Investigation Division enforces the criminal statutes applicable to income, estate, gift, employment, and excise tax laws, as well as applicable Title 31 and Title 18 violations per the IRM, that's Internal Revenue Manual, comma, involving United States citizens residing in foreign countries and non-resident aliens subject to federal income tax filing requirements. And then it goes on. But it's telling you right here that it's involving United States citizens residing in foreign countries, not the average Joe, no pun intended, living down the street from you or you yourself. This is the IRS's own internal manual. That's just an expansion of that language. So I wanted to just show you briefly that here is one of the promotions that I got. I think it was actually an award that I got back in June of 1995. Notice, yeah, it was a special act award. Just so you can see right here, Criminal Investigation Division. That's name and location of positions organization. That's where I worked. That's what the document says. Criminal Investigation Division. I'm going to have to just go quickly through this, but the Examination Division, same thing. Responsible for furnishing personnel to provide assistance during the filing period to taxpayers living abroad. The Collection Division, same thing, involving taxpayers outside the United States and those in United States territories, possessions, and in Puerto Rico. So what you have here is you have a hierarchy that existed at the time that I worked there. And I didn't learn this until I was challenged to prove, or I say disprove, evidence that people were giving me that this wasn't the case. And so I thought, well, maybe they've doctored it up on a copy, photocopy machine, or nowadays you call it Photoshop. So I went into the IRS's own library that was in the building that I worked in, and went into their manual and found that what these claims were on the outside from the public was actually true, that this is exactly what the IRS's own internal documentation showed. So needless to say, I was very, very concerned because, as I said at the beginning of my talk, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and I took that oath very, very seriously. I took it to God, and I'm not about to offend God, least of which doing it by taking an oath and not adhering to it. So this is just a brief thumbnail of the kind of information that I encountered. There's tons more, to be sure. It's been over 20 years since I resigned from the IRS. Obviously, February 25th of last year was the 20-year anniversary of my resignation. So I try to encourage people to educate themselves. I've got a lot of great information at AgentForTruth.ccom. I encourage people to look before you leap. There's no harm in researching this information for yourself. Of course, I don't encourage people to take on the IRS one-on-one. They're still the 800-pound gorilla, and they can squash you like a bug. I encourage educating yourself, educating others, asking other people to look at the information and the evidence for themselves. You don't have to believe me, but I would hope you'd at least check it out. Check out what I claim to be true, and prove it out to yourself. Also, we still do have a jury system, and if it wasn't for thinking jurors who were evaluating my conduct back when I was prosecuted, I might have done some time in Club Fed. But thankfully, there were thinking jurors, and I don't say that just because I was acquitted. I mean, they were paying attention, and they could see that the government case was just empty. So it's really important to infect the jury pool, as I say, with information so that they can make an informed decision, and that justice can be served when people are prosecuted for offenses. And as I've kind of mentioned throughout the talk, the media loves to demonize people who pay attention, and they try to tell people about facts. They call you a conspiracy theorist and some kind of miscreant, and I don't stand for that. You should speak up and defend them whenever possible. And I encourage people to pray and to we need prayer. I think it was God that gave us the many blessings to give us the country that we have, and I'd like to keep it. I'm sure you would too. So let's try to do that. And I thank you very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you got through that with your freedom and you didn't have to spend any time in Club Fed, for crying out loud, because we know how they like to throw people in there for this kind of thing, huh?
Yes, absolutely, Dre.
All right. Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all that wonderful information with us. You're our last guest here for the Taxation Is Theft Fest 2020.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been awesome. So many thanks to everyone.